thank you, as I say, for inviting me here today, and it's really wonderful to be here. I'll be taking you through a slightly more practical session, looking at a beautiful Renaissance artwork and seeing how we can explore through the four senses hermeneutic, which Angela has so beautifully articulated in her session, and move from looking at a work of art to asking perhaps what it might mean for us, and being able to see through it. And I don't just mean under drawings beneath the pigment. So I'm going to introduce this first slide here, which some of you may be familiar with this painting, and it's a painting that I've always loved. And as we know, what we love is what makes learning possible. So the Virgin of the Rocks is by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's in the National Gallery here in London. And we tend to think today, I think, especially when we look at works of art, as our eyes as being a sort of mechanical function of the human body. But William Blake describes this shift that happens in our mode of perception when he said to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. And Leonardo da Vinci similarly describes the eye as being the window to the soul. And that doesn't just mean the human soul, although it includes the human soul, but the idea of the soul at the time during the Renaissance was that it was something which was in and through every living part of the natural world and the heavens as well, and the human being was part of that. And this includes our interactions with each other in our ability to be able to really sort of see, look and see through. So art isn't just for the intellect, although it's, can be quite an intellectual exercise, but it's also for the senses. And I think we forget about our outer senses as well, which again, we just see as a sort of function of the human body, but our senses are portals really to a deeper knowing, and they keep us engaged with the world. And of course, it's for the soul. And I think the artist Grayson Perry recently said on Twitter that museums and galleries are gyms for the soul. And I have to say, I agree with him. But it's how we look at art that enables this shift, not just what we're doing and what we're looking at. And the four senses are a very helpful framework. But rather than think of them as a sort of linear progression, it's better to think of them as something which is unfolding and unraveling and a sort of spiraling, where it might awaken certain glimpses in you and through what you're looking at. Leonardo da Vinci wrote of the sensus communis, common sense, which again in our world today is a word that has become very flattened. And he said the imagination is unable to exist outside of the sensus communis unless it passes to the memory where it terminates and dies. If the thing imagined is not of great excellence. I think here as well we can sort of understand the importance of the image of the work of art in being a model of great beauty and greatness, and there to sort of indicate that there's something beyond surface impressions of what we're looking at. So if you have a pen and paper to hand, do grab one, because it might be helpful for you as we move through this. We haven't got a lot of time, but we can certainly do something in this session where you can record your own insights as we go through this process, and you can record your own feelings, and then at the end we'll see how we can discern what we might have glimpsed. So if we look at the literal and allegorical sense of the work of art, as Angela was explaining, it tends to sort of move along this horizontal level, if you like, which is great because we can learn a lot about it and we can gather information and we can know about all the historical aspects. So if we look at this work of art, well, what do we see, first of all? On a literal and allegorical sense, we see a group of sacred, holy figures. We have the Virgin in the center. with her arm around a young John the Baptist. There's a Christ child on the ground being held or comforted by an angel on the right, and the Christ child's hand is raised in a blessing. And the allegorical sense, we could say, so literal, you literally just sort of see it at face value. And in an allegorical sense, we could perhaps start to understand it in terms of simile, and another meaning evolves from what we're actually looking at. So we see the Virgin here, who seems to be illuminated in this divine light. And this painting at the time was created to be part of an altarpiece in a church in Milan. And the confraternity was about the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin. So not only was Christ immaculately conceived, but it became very important to prove that the Virgin was too. So we could see the allegorical meaning as, you know, it meaning something else. So we see her purity and we see her divinity in this way. But if you stay with the allegorical and the literal, we tend to just sort of find another meaning and another meaning and another meaning. It doesn't really take us through the image and into something beyond to see what might it be indicating other than what we literally see in front of us. So moving into the tropological sense, the tropological really is when we start to look at the image in a different way and we have a different mode of perception. So we move from looking at the image to engaging with it, participating with it, moving into an imaginal engagement. This also includes our outer senses as well. Neuroscientists have actually called this embodied cognition, and they have discovered that looking at a work of art and imagining that you're literally in the scene, projecting yourself into the depicted scene, or imagining that you're communing with the statue, has incredibly beneficial effects. They tend to look at these things in a very mechanical way, however, and not really in an imaginal sense. Carl Jung would have called this the active imagination. Leonardo da Vinci, in the time of the Renaissance, it would have been the higher imagination. And Gombrich, the art historian E.H. Gombrich, called it the beholder's share. So it's when you realize that not only you're looking at a work of art as a thing, and then this thing is sort of looking back at you, but you suddenly realize you're in the presence of something which is alive. It's a living presence. And not only you are beholding it, but it beholds you. And that is what he called the beholder's share. And it takes a certain quality, I think, in order to be able to move into this mode of participation. So you're not going to really be able to get there with the rational mind alone. So if we relax, contemplate the image, which is what it's encouraging us to do anyway, it allows the rational mind to settle, and then something else can arise. And Charles Nicholl, who is a biographer of Leonardo da Vinci, a current day biographer, describes Leonardo's mind when he's out in nature and his wonderful openness to the world around him, his real engagement through his senses with the world, looking at nature, because that was his inspiration for art and for the images that he was creating. And this is how he describes his mind: free of cares, the senses alert, the brain as receptive to impressions as the surface of a mirror, an almost explicitly childlike state of mental openness, with an uncluttered mind, seeing the visual evidence of the world before him with an accuracy and insight that led into the heart of things. So we're going to move into the heart of the image that we see and I'm going to move through each part of it so that you can see it in detail, and then we'll come back to it at the end. So while I'm moving through these images, if you want to write down literally what you see and describe it, but try to describe it in a sort of poetic way or a creative way, as if you're doing a piece of creative writing. And in that sense, you're able to enter into participation with the images. So it's not an assessment, you're not assessing it. And relax first of all, be aware of your breathing, go into a calmer mode, and then I'll move through these images slowly and literally write down what you see, but in a creative way, observing. So really opening your keen observation and the imagination at the same time. So this mode of the tropological is mediated through the heart and through the imagination. And a mode of questioning is helpful as well. So you can ask a question and imagine that you're dialoguing with the figures here. And so while you're writing still or moving into your engagement and participation with these images, you might start to see things possibly that remind you of the natural world. And Leonardo used to look at the shadows falling on the moon in order to understand how to shade the faces, especially of his female figures and divine ones here, such as Mary. He also had an incredible attention to the natural world and saw similarities between hair of the Virgin, for instance, here, and flowing water. So through the image, we can see the movements of the natural world. And perhaps something else moving that world behind its surface appearance. And during the Renaissance, there was a rebirth of classical learning and wisdom, and the image was there to carry and impart this wisdom to the viewer or the seer. And one of those aspects that was primary during the Renaissance was the idea of the creation of a three-dimensional space on a flat two-dimensional surface, which we can see in the Virgin of the Rocks there. But that's not just a clever technique, this sense of three-dimensionality and space. It's as if they're creating a space before us that we can enter, we're invited to enter through the pull of the imagination. And the proportions and harmony in the figures that Leonardo has used here in his Virgin of the Rocks are based on Pythagoras's cosmic ratios, and these are what the harmonics of music are based on as well. And Plotinus, a Neo-Platonist, would have considered himself a Platonist, considered that fantasia was the image-making faculty of the soul, and describes painting and sculpture, which imitated symmetry in nature and harmony of parts, as in music, is imitating that part of the faculty of the symmetry of the intelligible realm. So through the image, the cosmos is drawn down into the image, and at the same time, the image reflects back to the cosmos. And the imagination really is that mediating ground between the world of the physical, the earthly, and the celestial realm, and in the middle they meet. So after having completed your writing or engagement, participation with this image. The anagogic sense helps us to ground what insights perhaps we might have had. I think it's all very well looking at a painting or looking at a work of art and you can sort of go off into a fantasy perhaps with it, but it's much more helpful to be able to ground that, as Mark was saying in the introduction, these spiritual paths, these ways of knowing and seeing do need some sort of a framework within which to work. So with the anagogic, all the senses really can be seen at the same time, but it's also a return. So we return to the surface of the image again, but we see it anew, we see it differently. And how you understand your emotions and what you might have felt towards the image, the anagogic can help you to establish emotional feelings and sensations that you felt and situate them in a broader context of meaning. And by that, I mean, it's very easy, I think, when we look at works of art to suddenly make them all about you. So some people might have thought, gosh, well, you know, this reminds me of my aunt, or it reminds me of some, which is fine. But the image and what it's showing is not all about your emotions. So there's a sort of in-betweenness between you and the image, which needs to remain there. So a sort of third aspect, if you like, comes in to this. So the anagogic could also be understood in terms of how perhaps Jung and Hillman thought of knowing thyself and the imagination, meaning from your encounters, and these also have you. And Carl Jung describes which is as a creative cosmic function. And therefore, he said it's something that doesn't solely belong to you. It's not solely belonging to the individual. It's something that you can access. And since it combined conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, he believed it was deeply psychologically and emotionally healing, which relieved a burden on the individual and pressure on the human psyche to think you are all there is and that's it. There's nothing else aside from you, which is a very isolating way of thinking of yourself, but it's also symptomatic of our modern age. Hillman also spoke about knowing thyself. He says it means an archetypal knowing, a daemonic knowing, which means a familiarity with a host of psychic figures from geographical, historical, and cultural contexts, 100 channels beyond my personal identity. So I would recommend that you practice that engagement or participation with an image where you slow down and contemplate and are able to move into a dialogue or a participation with it. And when you come out of that process, to research your discoveries in a broader context. So that could be in a broader philosophical, psychological, or historical context. And that way, the image becomes a great teacher, and it certainly has been for me as well in my life. It's one of my favorite images, and it's highly talismanic, and it's a beautiful, beautiful contemplative image, something I think we need a lot more of in the world today. So thank you very much for joining. I hope that's been helpful for you in terms of how perhaps you might be able to look at beautiful works of art in a slightly different way, a more participatory way.
Thank you, Mary. It certainly was. It's very lovely just to have that slightly calmer 20 minutes to begin to get a feel for what we've been talking about earlier, and to have even that brief chance to look in these different ways as you so helpfully described, and know that this is the core of the tradition. This is at the heart of things as much as it needs recovering today.